The war in Iran is rocking the world's economy, and making headlines everywhere. But what's behind the headlines? What's actually happening inside Iran? Is this war going to make it more likely that a positive, constructive regime emerges for the world and for the Iranian people? Or is it going to make it less likely? What will be the actual consequences, and what are the cross currents going on inside of Iran? Well, today in this podcast, we are joined by Barbara Slavin, one of the leading experts on Iran over these last 30 years, who's going to engage in that conversation with us. If you're curious what's actually happening in Iran and what the future might look like, as well as the wisdom of this present war and how it's being waged, you want to listen to this episode. Let's get started. Hi, I'm Dr. John Izzo, and on behalf of my co-host, Alain Gauthier, I want to welcome you to this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast, where, as you know, we explore ideas and issues about the future of humanity and planet. We take on the big issues and try to help all of us think about how we can make change going forward. Now, today, of course, we're dealing with one of the most important issues of this very moment, which is the war in Iran. For decades, analysts and diplomats warned that a spark could ignite a major regional war in the Middle East. And today, the moment is no longer hypothetical. We're finally living through it. Its endgame is uncertain, the consequences unknowable, and its impact already reshaping the region in ways that will likely be felt for years, if not decades. The crisis carries also a heavy historical weight. At the dawn of the Islamic Republic, Iran held 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage for 444 days, an episode that defined U.S.-Iran relations for a generation. And in many ways, I would argue that the Islamic Republic has continued to hold much of the Middle East and perhaps its own people hostage ever since, through repression at home and proxy conflicts abroad. But what makes this moment even more consequential is that for the first time, the United States and Israel have come together to wage an offensive war against Iran. Let that not be lost on us. This is the first time in Israel's history that the United States has conducted an offensive war alongside of Israel. They've defended Israel many times, but never conducted a war alongside them. That alone opens the door to new dynamics, new risks, and new possibilities for what may follow. We're lucky to be joined today by someone who has spent her career helping us understand Iran beyond the headlines. Barbara Slavin is a longtime journalist, author, and one of the most respected American voices on Iran. She's also a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center, where I'm proud to be one of her colleagues. She has reported from Iran, interviewed its leaders, and studied its politics and society for decades. Few people can bring the depth of perspective that she can at this moment. And Barbara, we want to thank you for joining us again on The Way Forward.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.
So, Barbara, I remember last time we were together, before we get into the meat of this today, I remember last time when we had you on, you told us a beautiful story about when you first got interested in international politics, when you, as a young student, I don't remember, it was elementary school even, when you said that the Russians are people too, and you kind of got some flack for that. But talk to us about, you've spent so much of your professional life focused on Iran. Remind our listeners what first drew you to that country and what has kept that fascination alive over these decades.
Well, I think anybody who was alive during the hostage crisis, which you referenced, and the Iranian Revolution, was interested in this country. But I've made a bit of a specialty out of countries that the United States has no relations with or bad relations with. And that began as a student in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. Then in the 1980s, I was a correspondent for The Economist in China. And then later, I was a diplomatic correspondent for USA Today based in Washington. And it was at a time when Iran was showing indications that it wanted to change its pariah status and reach out to the West. And I found this irresistible. I had lived in Egypt also in the 1980s, but I didn't get a chance to go to Iran. I went to a lot of Arab countries. I went to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. And so I had an opportunity to go to Iran for the first time 30 years ago. to do a piece on the status of women in the Muslim world. This was after the Taliban had just consolidated control of Afghanistan for the first time. And my editor at the time wanted me to do this sort of comparative piece. So I said, why don't I go back to Egypt, where I know a lot of people? And I've always wanted to go to Iran. You know, I had heard from other journalists that it was much more nuanced and fascinating than a lot of the black-white portrayals would lead you to believe. And so I went for just a week in 96. I was blown away by the complexity of the society, the beauty of the country. And I was able to go back 8 more times and subsequently write a book about U.S.-Iran relations. Yes, Iran has committed many sins, but the record is not altogether one-sided. The United States has also missed significant opportunities or ruined opportunities to change the trajectory of the Iranian regime. And we are where we are today. This is not the first time. This is a continuation of the war that started in June of last year when the United States and Israel bombed Iran. But obviously, this war is much more devastating and has much more serious consequences.
Yeah, I agree. And my point was that this is the first time in all-out war, in essence. But you're right. The last year was the beginning with the bombing of the nuclear facilities was the beginning of this kind of level of cooperation. I want to start, Barbara. We're going to get into a lot of these things that you mentioned here, but let's start with an obvious question. Were you surprised by the decision to strike Iran now in this way? And what do you think drove the timing? Why do you think it happened now? Because it could have happened any time.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, yes, I was surprised because I've always thought this was a very bad move, and we can talk about why. No, because I think that both Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump were itching to do this. Some accounts blame the Israelis, but Donald Trump wanted to do this. He was puffed up by his success in Venezuela, the fact that he was able to extricate Mr. Maduro without a loss of American lives. And he thought somehow that U.S. military might was so great that he could pull off something similar, if not identical, in Iran. And this shows that he really doesn't understand Iran and doesn't understand the Middle East. He was looking for an excuse to do this. And there was a question about whether this might happen at the end of the year, but the Israelis were not ready. They didn't have sufficient defensive mechanisms in place. They wanted to build up their defenses some more. And the United States had most of its resources off the coast of Venezuela. So Trump waited. He made this promise to the Iranian demonstrators who were mowed down by their own government in January that help is on the way. But help was not on the way then. He had to wait to move all these assets into the region before he was ready to strike. But I think he was determined to do this.
Yeah, and certainly Netanyahu and the Israeli government have been itching to, go all out on Iran for a long time, right?
Particularly Netanyahu. Netanyahu has wanted to do this in a serious way since 2010, 2012. And he tried very hard to get Obama to agree to join with Israel to bomb Iranian nuclear sites. And Obama said no, and instead negotiated a diplomatic agreement that restrained Iran's nuclear program, an agreement that Trump quit unilaterally in 2018.
One of the ironic things, then I think Alon's going to take us to think about what your thoughts are further on this, but I was thinking you mentioned Venezuela, and I think one of the critical miscalculations already I see of the Trump administration on this one is that Venezuela is pretty much run by corrupt people, who just pretty much were there for the corruption. So you can do a deal with corrupt people. But this is a different situation. The leaders of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, they are zealots. And you could argue the Israelis may also be zealots. But what I mean is they're not eager just to do a deal. And as you said, maybe earlier that may have been true. And I'm wondering how your point about many times there was the opportunity for a deal. What's your thought about what that means now about the possibility of a deal ever emerging?
Yeah, first of all, I would object to using the term zealot. I think you have a deeply ideological regime, but also a very nationalistic one. This is a form of Iranian nationalism. The revolution was fought to get independence from the superpowers, particularly from the United States, which had interfered in Iranian politics since World War II. And, I don't personally remember this, but in 1953, the CIA overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the Iranian prime minister, on whose watch Iran nationalized its oil from the British. And the British conned us into a CIA operation to remove Mohammad Mossadegh and put the Shah back on the throne. And then 25 years later, there was an Iranian revolution against foreign interference in Iranian affairs. It's a country that has been repeatedly invaded. The British and the Russians basically controlled it at the turn of the last century. And so it is not just zealotry. It is a desire for sovereignty and independence on the part of these people, mixed with Islamic ideology and animosity in particular toward Israel and toward the United States for propping up Israel. It's also corruption, a lot of corruption in the system. So in that, it's similar to Venezuela, but it's a mixture of motivations on the part of the Iranian government. Remember, Iran is 2,500 years old as a coherent civilization, as an empire. And so this is a society with very, very deep roots. And you mess with this at your peril.
And a good example, isn't it? And now turn it over to Alon about colonialism always comes back to backfire, right?
Yeah.
Fractures society.
Imperialism, intervention, it comes back. It has blowback. Even if it takes a quarter of a century, you pay the price at some point for trying to direct the affairs of another country, another civilization.
Yeah. Amen to that. Alon, over to you.
Barbara, you said a little while ago that this was a bad move. And I would like to ask, and from where you sit, then, what are the most realistic pathways for how this crisis could unfold?
Well, I think that Donald Trump is going to call a ceasefire in a week or two. Price of oil is well over $100 a barrel. The stock market, the last time I checked, was down another 800 points or 1,000 points. Inflation is up. We have midterm elections coming in November. He has to cut this short, or the impact on the U.S. and world economies is going to be absolutely devastating. Iran has, for the first time, effectively blocked the Strait of Hormuz, preventing 20% of the world's oil from getting out and a good bit of its liquefied natural gas. Shipping of all sorts is interrupted. Infrastructure is being hit in the GCC states, terrifying business people and tourists who used to think this was a bubble of stability in the Middle East. It's not. The bubble has burst. So this cannot go on that much longer. And Iran will outlast the United States. I think I heard Pete Hegseth saying last week that Iran can't outlast the U.S. Well, I could say something impolite now. Iran will outlast the United States, I think, because this was a war that was entered into without any reasonable, feasible objectives or a day after plan. It will degrade Iran's military infrastructure along with its civilian infrastructure. It will make it a poorer and weaker place. It will also make it angrier, more resentful, more determined to exact revenge, one way or the other, on the United States and Israel. And again, we cannot know now how Iran will respond going down the road, but I think it's a fair bet that there will be very negative repercussions that perhaps were not even anticipated certainly not by Donald Trump, and maybe even not by the Israelis.
And from that perspective, are there some scenarios, analysis, are there some scenarios analysts are not paying enough attention to?
No, I think actually the analyst class has been pretty unified. Okay. And this was not the war we should have gotten into. I mean, I just got my copy of The Economist. A war without a strategy is their headline. And, they and everyone else is saying, this was unnecessary. I mean, Iran was not presenting an imminent threat to the United States, not even to Israel at this point. It had suffered a lot of blows over the last couple of years. And yes, that was why Donald Trump thought this was a good idea, because he saw Iran as being weak. But weak is not the same thing as defenseless. And as I said, Iran is pulling out all the stops. Strait of Hormuz, hitting infrastructure in the GCC, including a desalinization plant in Bahrain. Iran has 80,000 drones. So even if the U.S. sinks the Navy, gets rid of the Air Force, Iran has never had much of an Air Force, not since the Shah's day. It has drones, and those drones, not all of them can be intercepted. They're cheap and plentiful and easy to manufacture in undisclosed locations. So that's why I say Iran will outlast the United States.
I wonder, Barbara, can we turn for a moment to the human dimension of this? I'm curious your perspective of what may be happening inside for the Iranian people. And I give you just two interesting data points. I have a friend who's an expat from Iran who happened to be on a boat with 500 other expats. She lives in California at the time the war broke out. And I happened to be on a call with Homa. And I said, how are, these expat Iranians, and many of whom still go back and forth to Iran? And she said, well, first of all, many people in Iran now feel things are so bad that anything is better than what's been happening. And there were journalists, as you know, who finally got into Tehran, and they may be cherry picking the interviews, but there were interviews of Iranians saying, I feel very conflicted because on the one hand, I hate seeing bombs. It's very scary. But at the same time, something has to change. Yeah. So there are a lot of, and as you know, we recently had all these protests that, as has happened many times, wound up getting quelled, and we don't know how many people died. It might be 3,000, might be 30,000. Who knows? What's your sense of what's happening inside Iran? If people were free to speak, what's your sense of the countervailing forces in Iran and what that may mean both from a human perspective, but also for the future of Iran and its relationships with the world?
Yeah, I think people are feeling very conflicted. Clearly Ayatollah Khamenei, the elder, was not popular. The regime is not popular. As you pointed out, there were massive protests in January, which were brutally put down. But the problem is this: you can't get rid of a regime like that by bombing it. It's even hard to do it with ground forces, which we are not at this point employing. So I think that there was the initial, yes, this is fantastic, kill them all, kill the Ayatollahs. And then the realization that, oh my God, they bombed the building next to me and my neighbor died. They bombed the refinery, oil refinery on the outskirts of Tehran, and there's a horrible acid rain falling on my head and polluting what is already a very polluted city. And the supreme leader is dead, and now his son is the supreme leader. So I think that there may be buyer's remorse among many who wanted this or thought they wanted this. You cannot do regime change from the air. You simply can't. And Donald Trump has made it very clear that he has no nation-building plan. I think, again, Pete Hegseth, our Secretary of War, has said repeatedly, no nation building. This is not Iraq. Well, that means chaos, or a power vacuum at best, or at worst, a consolidation of an already extremely repressive regime. And right now we're seeing, I think, the latter. And we're even seeing in the diaspora community, if you look at the commentary on social media, some of the people who were cheering this on, I'm thinking of a woman called Masih Ali-Najad. She has this frizzy hair and a flower stuck in her hair, who's been egging this on for years and has suddenly gone quiet because they see what the devastation is. On the first day, the U.S. hit a school accidentally near an IRGC facility and killed over 100 Iranian schoolgirls. That's how we started this war. Over 1,000 Iranians are dead. Many of them are civilians. So wars are they can get out of hand very quickly, particularly if there is no strategy, real strategy behind it, except punishment and degradation, which is the strategy here of, hit as many missile production sites as possible, hit as many missile launcher sites as possible, hit the nuclear facilities yet again, and hope that, this somehow will solve your problem for you. I don't think it will.
Life is likely to get even harder for the Iranian people now, isn't it? It's not likely to get, certainly in the short and medium term, there's not a lot of path for life to get better in every way.
No, not at all. And you have to remember the January protests started because of the sudden collapse of the Iranian currency. It started with electronics merchants in the bazaar who didn't know how to price their iPhones because the currency was devaluating so quickly. And our Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, bragged that he had somehow brought about a shortage of dollars very, very rapidly, which caused this collapse. And he thought this was wonderful. So people went out on the streets and risked their lives, and thousands were killed. And we still have the Iranian regime.
One of the questions that we were wondering ahead of time was, does this make it more or less likely that Iran pursues a nuclear bomb? Seems to me, if I were them, I would be like, let's fast track it because North Korea can do whatever they want because they have them now. But you made a good point. And a lot of analysts have said the military objective for this, you can see how within a few weeks, Trump and the Israelis, maybe the Israelis more reluctantly, but Trump declare victory, saying we've kind of gotten rid of the Navy, we've set them back, and we can hold them in check. And well, what happens for the Iranian people is up to them, right? You could see that happening.
He's already said it.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, and as you said, the political calculus almost demands that, right? I said from the beginning, 3 to 5 weeks was the most Americans could support I don't think they support the war, period, but 3 to 5 weeks is about the most a president could probably get away with. But let's talk about, what might happen. Alon, maybe let's explore what some options are.
Yes. What do you see as the best case and the worst case outcomes for Iran, for its neighbors, and for the broader region?
Well, the best case is that we get a ceasefire very quickly. Everybody takes a deep breath and steps back from this. I don't think any real diplomacy is possible between Iran and the Trump administration. I mean, how many bridges can you burn? This is the second time the U.S. has attacked Iran while in the midst of so-called negotiations. And of course, Trump in his first term withdrew from an Iran deal that was functioning until Trump pulled out of it. So some sort of uneasy ceasefire that goes on while everybody licks their wounds and tries to recover from this. Maybe some diplomacy on the part of the Arabs, China, to try to stabilize the situation. But it's really hard to see much good coming out of this within Iran. There was hope that once Ayatollah Khamenei, the elder, was removed from the scene, we might be able to see some recalibration on the part of the Iranian system. I guess it's still possible under his son or a successor if his son is killed. We remember that the Israelis and the United States have threatened now to kill the new supreme leader and presumably others after. We could see some recalibration. Certainly, Iran is going to have to lick its wounds after this. And the best case scenario is that some effort is made to try to repair the breach with the Iranian people. Iran is a very complicated system. It has political parties, individuals who might step into the breach and begin to try to fashion a new social compact. It's not going to be easy, I think, certainly not while the bombs are falling and not for a long time after that. This is a regime that is going to settle scores and be even more paranoid and vindictive for a while, but ultimately perhaps we could see some shifts there. That's the best case. Worst case, I mean, there are just so many. The war goes on, and there's more damage and devastation throughout the region. More people are killed in Iran, Israel, the Gulf. More Americans die. Price of oil remains elevated. The world goes into a deep recession. as a result of this unprovoked war. And we all, have to desperately focus on our internal problems and not on exterior issues, at least for a while. And somehow Iran gets a hold of the 900 pounds of 60% enriched uranium, which is under rubble in Isfahan, removes that and finds a place to make a nuclear weapon. That certainly would be the worst case scenario.
I know the Israelis, as you pointed out, they went even further than Trump administration. They said that we will take out any subsequent. They almost sound like we don't care how many subsequent leaders. The rhetoric was kind of, we don't care how many subsequent leaders you choose. We're going to take them out. And I mean, obviously, that's an extreme. Do you think at some point?
Israel has had a policy of assassination for a very long time, and it seems to think that killing these people improves its posture. But there's always somebody else. Do you know how many clerics there are in Iran? There's a city called Qum where the major seminaries are located, and my late lovely driver on my trips to Iran used to call it the mullah factory. You kill one, there will be another. I don't see that killing these people, maybe it buys you time, maybe it disorients your adversary for a while, but there's always another one. If you don't solve root causes, there's always another one.
Yeah. You think that I agree with you wholeheartedly. And it's kind of like whack-a-mole in a way, right? You're just going to, but of course, much more serious than whack-a-mole. And, I've read some people say, and I would agree with this, see if you agree, that while Israel would love to have a friendly Iran, they think that's unlikely. So they would rather have an Iran in complete disarray, collapse. They'd rather have Syria 2.0 than the regime to survive. Whereas I think Trump his fantasy is to have someone he can deal with, right? Reasonably deal with. And again, as you said, many opportunities already lost. And I feel like Israel and the U.S. will start to diverge in their interests, and Israel will have an interest in keeping the war going, because the Israeli people, and this is not a criticism, I think are willing to stay in bomb shelters for a long time, much longer than Americans are willing to pay higher gas prices to go after Iran. And I suspect there's going to be some tension in that relationship if this goes on very long.
Yeah, I mean, there already is. Trump complained that the Israelis bombed the Iranian oil refinery, the big one outside Tehran, and Trump wants the oil. Just like Venezuela. The way I described it last week was that Trump wanted a Venezuela and Israel wants a Libya. Israel wants a broken country in chaos, in civil war that cannot pose a threat to anybody outside, except maybe through, refugee flows, which we would see certainly in that kind of scenario. But yeah, Trump is looking for his Iranian Delcy Rodriguez, and such a person does not exist.
Yeah, I feel like in some ways Trump had that fantasy, right? I think he was serious when he said that people should rise. I mean, I think it was delusional, but I think he was serious that the people will rise up, and meaning like he had some level of fantasy that this would cause regime change. And I mean, I don't know how he could imagine that.
Good on that day. Come on, this is Donald Trump.
I know. On his best days, he probably has those kind of fantasies.
I mean, don't ascribe deep strategic thinking.
No, I didn't. I'm ascribing like the opposite, describing that like without thinking through the possibility that could happen.
Did you notice he was going to energize the Kurds, and then he changed his mind when the prime minister of Turkey called him and said, "No, that's not a good idea. We would be very upset if you started helping the Kurds."
Plus, the Kurds have been used a few times and then turned around and got bitten by
any of this. He doesn't think through any of this, and he has no guardrails around him now.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation we're having with Barbara Slavin about the present situation in Iran as much as we are, and we'll get back to it in just a moment. But for now, I'd like to thank you for being a part of our community and to really encourage you to follow us on whatever platform you're listening or watching this program. It helps us so much by you following. You will not miss the next episode and other events that we put on, but also means it can help grow our community. And please comment as well. Remember, this is a two-way conversation. And when you comment, you make a beginning of a conversation with others in our community, because it's not just us talking, it's us talking to each other. And finally, please go to our website, wayforwardpodcast.com, where you can sign up and find out about our events, see all the previous episodes, as well as if you want, support us through Buy Me a Coffee. But meanwhile, we thank you for being a part of our community, and we'd love you to comment, to follow us, and to reach out to us. Now let's get back to Barbara.
I mean, we did have reports before the war that members of the military were advising him that this was a very risky thing to do. But he brushed it aside because he wanted to do it. And the days when he had a Jim Mattis or a Kelly or I'm trying to think of the others who were checks on him. I mean, there weren't that many, but he had professional people in his first term who told him, no, this is not a good idea. And he didn't. But now he doesn't have any of those people in a position to tell him no.
And Barbara, from a global perspective, what are China and Russia likely to do as this unfolds? Will they intervene, stay on the sidelines, use this an opportunity elsewhere, Taiwan, Ukraine? It would be very interesting to look at that.
Well, they're both benefiting. Russia, because the price of oil has skyrocketed, and also Trump has lifted sanctions on the sale of Russian oil to India. Yeah. So Russia is making out like gangbusters. The Russians are also providing intelligence to Iran, which it is using against American targets. And when asked about this, the White House press secretary seemed to think there was nothing untoward about it. Unbelievable. China is the adult in the room. It sits back and says, look, the United States has started another crazy war, and it's hurting the world economy. And we, China, are, we're the responsible stakeholder, and we're the country that should be leading the world order. So both Russia and China are benefiting enormously.
And another question that may be in the minds of Americans who could be or Canadians or Europeans that could experience some strengthened terrorist activity. Although Iran is weakened, what happens to Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis that Iran has been supporting?
Yeah, well, we saw Hezbollah very unwisely get into a new war with Israel, which has resulted in hundreds of deaths already in Lebanon and something like a fifth of the population being displaced yet again from South Lebanon and from the southern suburbs of Beirut. The Houthis have not yet gotten into the act. I think they may at some point if this goes on, but so far they've not. We've seen militias in Iraq attack American targets in Baghdad and in the north of Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan. Hamas, I think, is preoccupied with its own predicament in Gaza. But we have seen this. And of course, terrorism. Yeah, it doesn't have to be Iran-backed terrorists. It can simply be someone who is inspired by this war and feels that the United States has once again behaved in a horrible manner toward a Muslim country, and simply decides that this is the moment when they should attack a soft target in the United States or Canada or Europe or Australia or New Zealand, simply to get back at them for a war that has already killed more than 1,000 Iranians.
And in many ways, we've had a long hiatus after the kind of what happened with ISIS kind of collapsing. In many ways, we had kind of a hiatus of this kind of terrorism acts across the world. And one can't help but think this might spur a new round of that.
I mean, we've already seen people who've been motivated by Gaza and the death of over 70,000 Palestinians. So now you have, Iranians on top of that, right? I mean, there are people who resent this and think that the United States and Israel have no right to kill so many Muslims. And they will take matters into their hands. It also could just be some garden variety crazy with access to guns. And Lord knows we have enough of them.
One of the other things that this has done, I was thinking of my good friend whose son was just in Dubai before this for weeks and weeks visiting a friend. And I know lots of people who have lived or live in that area of the world. This has sure shaken that sense of, these were kind of meccas, maybe pun intended, of economic prosperity in the Middle East. And what do you think this means for their relationship with the Iranian regime? I mean, it's clear why Iran is doing it because, they want the war to end quickly. So the more they damage economic infrastructure and shake up oil, the more that's going to happen. But they're really burning some bridges, aren't they, with folks who've tried to at least bring some resolution. So do you think this may shake up the feeling of stability in the entire region for some time? And what are your thoughts on some of that?
Yeah, well, this is a region that has never really been at peace, but
Right.
particularly since the Hamas attacks on Israel, it has not been at peace. We had a sort of ceasefire in Gaza, but, Palestinians were being killed every day. We had a sort of ceasefire in Lebanon, but Israel was attacking Lebanon every other day, and it was also attacking Syria. So it's false to say that it was at peace, but obviously everything now has been amped up enormously because of this war. The GCC states and Iran, they've always been rivals. There's no love lost there. And I think these countries understand why Iran is doing this, even if they're unhappy about it. And they tried to persuade the United States and Israel not to start a war. They tried and tried. Look at what the Omanis were doing, and others as well, the Qataris, the Saudis, but Trump didn't listen. And so I think that there will be a reevaluation of their relationship with the United States and Israel. The talk of the Abraham Accords expanding, well, forget about that. But a lot of these countries are going to feel that having American bases on their territory leaves them more vulnerable and does not protect them against adversaries. So I think there will be a lot of ripple effects over time.
So, Barbara, I'm thinking if I were a listener or viewer here, I'd be thinking, this is a very depressing podcast.
I'm sorry.
I know, no, I don't mean that at you. So I don't want to say what's the good news, but it's more maybe going back to the best case scenario. Put on your Solomon, hat, your wisdom hat here. And if you were to give advice about the path forward from here that might be more constructive, even if you think it less likely, what do you think is a potential path forward that might lead to a more constructive outcome, even if it takes some time to get there?
Well, anybody who's read my book knows that I've not been a supporter of U.S. policy toward Iran for a very long time. I think we've really gone about this the wrong way. What you want to do is empower Iranian people to take more power in their own country. And you can't do that by bombing them and sanctioning them. Particularly economic sanctions have made Iranian society much poorer. It's made it much more difficult for people to be able to sustain protests. So I would say a ceasefire very quickly and an effort to put forward some sort of diplomatic offer that's realistic, that doesn't require capitulation on the part of Iran, but that is realistic, and that eventually looks toward recognition, diplomatic recognition, and relief of sanctions. That would enable the Iranian people to begin to change their own government. But politically, that's not realistic in the United States, especially not after this war. I think we're going to have to wait until after Trump. This is always the problem. We finally get a decent policy toward Iran, as we did under Obama, and then we get a new administration that throws it all out the window. There's more continuity in authoritarian places like Iran, obviously, than there is in the United States. So it's going to be very difficult, but all regimes, bad regimes, eventually do come to an end. Unfortunately, sometimes they get a lot worse before they get better.
You've spent a lifetime of trying to help us understand your book, Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, and your work at the Stimson Center has, been really important. I'm curious, given that you've spent your career trying to help Americans in the West understand Iran and Iranians, in this moment, what do you most want Americans, people in the West, to understand about Iran? What would be most helpful for them to understand about Iran that might help pave the way for a constructive path forward. And by the way, I should go without saying, people should listen to our previous podcast with you, in which you talked about the fact that one of the challenges each U.S. administration changing every 4 or 8 years is part of the issue. So we have not had a consistent path. And so please listen to that previous podcast. But talk about, what would you most want people to understand about Iran and the Iranian nation and culture that you think would help us even as we frame going forward?
Oh, look, I mean, try to understand your adversary. Don't demonize people. Understand that this is a long and deep culture, that many of the problems we have with Iran exerting influence in the region, Iran has always exerted influence in its region by virtue of its size, by virtue of its population, by virtue of its Shia faith, by virtue of its culture, its literature, its poetry. So again, Trump talks about, and others talk about, eliminating Iran's ability to project power in the Middle East. That's delusional. It's not going to happen. You have particularly Shia Muslims throughout the region who identify with Iran to some extent or another because it's the largest Shia Muslim country, and Shiism is a minority sect in Islam and historically discriminated against by the majority Sunni sect. So after the U.S. attacked Iran, we saw protests outside the U.S. embassy in Pakistan, which is 30% Shia. In Lebanon, obviously, Shia are a large percentage of the population. In Iraq, they're a plurality, if not a majority. In Bahrain, even in Saudi Arabia, there are many, many Shia. So Iran will always exert influence in the Middle East. We have to try to put forward policies that incentivize Iran to exert influence in a positive manner and not in a negative one. And some of that can be done through military force, but not all of it. And clearly, if we're at this point now, what we've done over the last 47 years has been a colossal failure, or we wouldn't be at this stage. So read, understand the culture, read the Shahnameh, read Rumi, read Hafez, read my book. These are people with tremendous capacity for joy and celebration and a wonderful culture. So everybody knows about Iranian food and culture, Iranian film. Treat them as you would want to be treated yourself and give them that respect. And you would be surprised how far that might go.
I'm thinking, Barbara, of that initial instinct you had about the Russians are people too, right? That you've spent a lifetime helping. It's so easy to just demonize the people who we call enemies at any given moment. And yet we can't ever build a bridge if we don't take the time to understand.
Yeah, no, it's Americans. I mean, we have a very binary, black, white kind of politics when it comes to
I hadn't noticed
international affairs. Yeah. And it hurts us. It always hurts us because we wind up, not understanding our adversaries and thereby making, mistake after mistake. Look at the military interventions we've undertaken. I mean, we got rid of the Taliban and now we have the Taliban back. Iraq is still a very troubled place where I would argue that Iran has more influence than the United States. And we killed one Ayatollah Khamenei and now we have another Ayatollah Khamenei. I mean, think for a minute before we do these things. It just defies logic. And, I think the fact that this is not a popular war, that Trump didn't even bother to try to explain the motivation for it. I mean, essentially, he threw spaghetti at the wall and, see what would stick. And nothing is really sticking, If you compare it, a lot of people were nostalgic for George W. Bush, who took us to war in Iraq under false pretenses, but at least tried to convince us it was a good idea. For more than a year before the U.S. invaded, went to the UN, went to Congress. Trump has dispensed with all of that. And that's another reason why this war is not popular and hopefully will not last long.
Question for you. Some listeners may be wondering about, obviously, the regime's official position has been very, and in terms of their funding of some of these proxies against Israel, have been very, Israel as a state. Do you feel most Iranians, forget this present war moment, let's say before this war moment, that the vast majority of people in Iran would say, we're okay being at peace with Israel, let Israel exist, and we just want to have, a decent life? And do you think that represents the majority of the Iranian people who really, again, they may have resentments against Israel for some things that have happened, but they're not really trying to eliminate the Jewish state? Because that's kind of like the myth, right? Is that the Iranians are all completely against, Israel.
Majority of Iranians are not anti-Israel, and most of them could care less about the Palestinians. And this has been true for a very long time. But the regime is against the state of Israel. And that, I think, has been its big strategic mistake. Again, there were opportunities to change that under Mohammad Khatami in the 90s. After September 11, the Iranians wanted to have a broad agreement with the United States that would have addressed these issues. There were ways to mitigate that, but because the United States has maintained its hostility toward Iran or resumed it under Trump, those opportunities to convince the Iranians to tone down the anti-Israel stuff, I think that disappeared as well. This is an ideology. This is an Islamic ideology. Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the revolution, was very opposed to Israel. He saw it as a Western colonial implant in the region, not alone in feeling that way. And of course, the Shah had been very close to Israel. And so it was a reaction to the Shah as well. And it's turned out to be catastrophic for Iran. But this has been the policy. And as I said, there have been moments when perhaps we could have steered Iran away from it and, with agreements on nuclear issues, sanctions relief, and so on. But we've not made it worth their while to give this up. The fault is on Iran primarily for adopting this stance, but on us as well for not finding a way to give them a pathway out of it that, again, enabled the regime to save face. As long as we think we can bludgeon this government into doing what we want, we're not going to get anywhere. Who wants to be punched in the face and told, do what I say or else? And that is Donald Trump's attitude toward most of the world, allies and adversaries. And it doesn't work very well, and we're seeing that.
Barbara, as a Frenchman, I am asking myself, can the Europeans who have their share in the Middle East mess play a useful role in the next few years in that situation?
Europeans haven't played a useful role since 2018. No, seriously. They're playing a useful role in Ukraine, but not when it comes to Iran. Back in the day, Europeans helped negotiate with Iran some agreements while the George W. Bush administration refused to negotiate with Iran unless it would agree to give up its nuclear program. Europeans stepped in, particularly Britain, France, and Germany, and they were great, paved the way for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015. But after Trump pulled out, Europeans tried to maintain some sort of trade ties with Iran, but it was impossible because of U.S. economic sanctions. So Iran pivoted to Russia and China, particularly to China. And since that time, frankly, Europeans have not been able to play much of a role. Also, under Javier Solana and others, not trying to think who came after him. The EU High Representative after Solana was also pretty good, and I've forgotten his name. Spaniard, former Spanish foreign minister, maybe you remember his name. He was good too. After that, we have now an Estonian, I believe, or I forget her nationality. It's all about Ukraine. And so Europe doesn't forgive Iran for providing drones to Russia to use in Ukraine. And, it's basically, I don't think Europe is happy about this war, but they don't seem to be doing very much to get in the way. In fact, they seem to be increasingly stepping in to help the United States and Israel. I've been very underwhelmed, to say the least, by Europe.
Thank you.
One gets the feeling that, at least in this present moment, I split my time between Canada and the U.S. I'm a dual citizen, and I think there are countries like Canada and the European Union at this point may feel pretty helpless to do very much, and they may actually be right that there isn't much they can do right now, even though they may want to. Barbara, what final message would you want to share with our audience, in closing? I really appreciate, by the way, all the insight that you've given us into what is a very difficult and sad, moment.
Yeah, I was trying to find the name of the previous High Representative of the EU. Now it's Kaja Kallas, who has taken a very, very anti-Iran stance. Anyway, I will find that name and let you know, because the one before her was actually fairly constructive, or at least tried to be. But as I said, basically, it's been impossible since Ukraine. Look, encourage Donald Trump to declare victory and end this war as fast as humanly possible before he does more damage to Iran, to the GCC, to the international economy, to Israeli civilians. Declare victory and end it.
Fair enough. Well, Alon, any closing comment from you? Then I'll bring us to a close. And again, we encourage you to read Barbara's books, look her up. She's got look up her work at the Stimson Center as well. A lot of important things to share with us. Alon, any closing thoughts from you?
Well, I thank you, Barbara, for this very enlightening conversation we had about this. One thing that keeps bugging me a little bit is to have heard the president of Iran make apologies if the other countries in the Gulf had been bombed. And it may be a bit late to bring this up, but is there actually, are there some dissensions within the Iranian government that explains that gesture?
Yeah, well, I think Pezeshkian, the president, has spent a lot of time trying to mend ties with these countries. Yeah. So it's difficult watching, but he is not an important player in the Iranian system. So I wouldn't put much stock in it. It was Josep Borrell, who was the high representative for foreign policy for the EU before Kaja Kallas. So I just wanted to give him credit. He was a very strong proponent of European diplomacy with Iran. So I wanted to do that. No, Pezeshkian and the reform movement in general in Iran has been much, much weakened over the years by a system which has been dominated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and hardline clerics, and they are the people who remain in control.
So I guess my closing thought, thank you, Barbara, is I find myself deeply saddened by all of this. I often think to myself, all these millions of years of evolution, and we're still at war with each other, launching missiles at each other and trying to develop bombs of mass destruction if we don't have them. And I'm deeply sad for our people of Iran in all of this, because it seems to me their life is going to be worse off, at least in the short and medium term, from all of this. And I was really struck by something you said, Barbara, when I asked that question about the sentiment towards Israel. And just, I had said at the beginning that in many ways, the regime has held the Iranian people hostage over these last 40 years as well. And I can't help but, and I'm not putting it all on them, as you said, there are many countervailing forces on all sides. But just thinking about the people of Iran, I wish they one day can be free. It's such a rich and beautiful culture with such a great history and so much to offer the world. I'm tearing up even as I say it. So that's where my prayers go. And certainly, as you've pointed out, Barbara, this will not make that any more likely in the short or medium term. But one can always hope. And as you said, Barbara, a great reminder, I think as Gandhi, who said, for a time, tyrants rule, but they have always fallen. And there are many tyrants who perhaps need to fall. So anyway, thank you, Barbara. And thank you, our listeners and viewers. If you love what you've heard, please let us know. Please follow us and share it and comment on whatever site you are finding us on. And if you want to buy us a coffee and support our work, you can see that on our link tree on our site, wayforwardpodcast.com. As always, we end every podcast reminding us that history is not a destination waiting for us to arrive. What we will one day call history will be the result of the actions that we take today. And as Barbara reminded us, we as individual citizens are not on the sidelines in this moment. We always can express our voice, and our voice matters. We'll see you next time on The Way Forward.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. I'm Jim Burke, the producer. If you found this conversation as enlightening and motivating as we did, please subscribe to our podcast and YouTube channels. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these vital discussions to a broader audience. Don't forget to share this episode with your network, and let's work together to build a better world for all generations. Find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, and now on Instagram and YouTube Shorts. Together, we can make a difference. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's episode and any suggestions you have for future guests. Please send your thoughts and recommendations to thewayforwardrc@gmail.com. Your input is invaluable in helping us shape the future of this podcast. Thank you for being part of the Way Forward community.